My name is Shea Swauger. I work at the Auraria Library. I have a background in philosophy and library science, so I'm a natural fit for this panel. I feel like I bring a lot to the table here. I only say that tongue-in-cheek, actually. I'm also the director of something called the Data Policy Project, which is an interdisciplinary project using data and evidence-based methods to look at policy and equity. And this is an applications panel, and we're trying to talk about how data science is applied in different fields. And so, weirdly, I do have expertise in a way that we don't normally associate with data science, which is kind of cool. So I feel very lucky to be here, and I'm just happy to participate. So instead of introducing everyone, I'm actually going to have each person introduce themselves. So please, we're going to start down there to here. Please say your name, your role, and then also your pronouns and how you would like to be referred to should questions come up.
So my name is Brian Keegan, he, his, him. I'm an assistant professor at University of Colorado Boulder in the Department of Information Science. Anything else? And on this panel, I'm going to be talking about data science in the cannabis industry. Does that work?
Yeah. So I'm Paul Teske, he, him, his. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Affairs here at the University of Colorado, Denver. In my own research, I do research on state and local public policy, most specifically probably education policy, in particular where there's big data kinds of questions that I've worked with. And I get to observe my faculty that work in public administration, public policy, and criminal justice, some of whom work heavily with data. So I think that's what I'm here for. Thanks.
My name is Katerina Kechris. I'm a professor of Biostatistics and Informatics at the Colorado School of Public Health at the Anschutz Medical Campus. And my role is I develop data science methods and software for the analysis of big data in the biomedical field. She, her, hers.
Hi, I'm Austin Troy, he, him, his. I'm chair and professor in the Department of Urban Regional Planning here at CU Denver. And I'll be talking about big data in urban planning, which, as you can imagine, is a pretty huge topic. It's like condensing a whole semester into 3 minutes, so you'll have to just bear with me on it. So thanks.
Hi, I'm Timothy Viss, and I'm a software engineer at Google Boulder. Let's see. My experience with data science largely falls into the machine learning side of things. I work on Google Drive, particularly using what data we have about users to help them find their files more quickly within Google Drive.
All right. So we've got 3 questions. We're going to go through the panel, same order. If anyone wants to jump in and be like, oh my God, that's my question, that's okay too. And normally we've got about 15 minutes at the end, but if there's like something you have to say, please raise your hand. I can run out. We can be flexible. This can be a conversation. So the first question is, what is the greatest opportunity or benefit you see for the application of data science to your field? So we'll kick it down to the end.
All right. So didn't come or start my role here at Colorado studying with an interest. I didn't go into the job talk saying I want to study data science in the cannabis industry. It was really moving here and just realizing all the different moving pieces that are involved here that I began to just see all the just really fascinating opportunities to see a brand new market emerge here in Colorado since 2014, 2012, if you think about medical, in the context of the profound transformation, the digital transformation, data-driven decision-making, all these things that are happening in the context of this huge change in policy and public opinion is a fascinating way to think about the intersection of the role that data science is having in popular society, popular culture, politics, and policy. Because the capabilities for doing bioinformatics, for doing marketing, for using social platforms, all of the synthetic biology, supply chain management, all of these things did not exist in the same kinds of capacities were legalization unfolding in 2004, 1994. So it's a really exciting opportunity to think about, use this brand new industry that's starting up to think about, what does it mean for a new industry that's trying to figure out its own identity, figure out some very complex regulatory challenges, and how they're marshaling the potential and the power of data to to guide themselves through all of that. In particular, what I'm looking at in my research here in Colorado, the Marijuana Enforcement Division at the Department of Revenue requires everyone who participates in the statewide cannabis market to submit all their daily inventory to a central database every single day. And if you don't use this database, you don't enter your data in the right way, like you face up to jail time. And so this is called the metric system, again, not kilograms and meters, but it's the Marijuana Enforcement Regulation, Tracking, and Control. So the idea that like an entire marketplace operating across an entire state that with about $1.5 billion in total revenue is submitting every day, every single actor in that market is submitting all their daily inventory, all of their transactions to a central government database is remarkable. I think that a lot of us might think that we might want to see these systems in other kinds of policy settings. But what does it mean to have these kinds of capabilities? How is it being used by law enforcement? How is it changing the practice of, on the private side, on the industry side, how it is that they're going about cultivating, creating data cultures of like, how do we go about doing auditing and accounting? Like, we already have all this data. What do we do with it? How do we make sense of it in ways that new markets where they're emerging were not possible? So I'll leave that there and let other folks go.
That work sounds fascinating, maybe more interesting what I'm going to talk about, but generally in public policy, and especially the part of it that's been influenced by economics, we've already been doing, regression analysis data. That's sort of a core element for the last 30 or so years in much of the research, but it tends to be with pretty small databases and therefore limited power and limited conclusions in terms of statistical significance, substantive significance of whether some public policy change makes a difference. And so in the world of education policy, everybody wants to move student achievement, right? Test scores, other things that we can measure, graduation, going to college, whatever it may be. And there's lots of students, so there's big data, but most of the interventions that we look at that are at least a step or two removed from what might happen in the classroom, whether it's paying teachers differently, whether it's having principals, better trained, whether it's some new curriculum. Everybody wants sort of the golden bullet is, or silver bullet is kind of what program makes the biggest difference. And, at the federal level, there's something called the Institute for Education Sciences, IES. It funds a lot of big studies of education outcomes, and and they set up something called the What Works Clearinghouse on the idea that we need to learn what works and then do more of that. And it's kind of jokingly called the What Doesn't Work Clearinghouse because most of the findings are not very strong, either in terms of statistical significance, none at all, or substantive significance. And I think that's true in a lot of social science areas. The effects are nuanced. They're hard to tease out. They're small, which is not to say they're not important, but we have very few. I used to have a colleague who would say, we've learned a lot in the last 50 years from social science and medical research. We've learned that smoking is bad for you, right? We're pretty sure about that. But everything else, whether it's not vaping, wine, chocolate, whatever it may be in the medical world. Similarly, in the social science world, it's tough to figure out what really works, or it might work in one context but not in another. So I think big data gives you the chance to, look at these more nuanced effects, have huge, larger sample sizes, and tease out effects that obviously we couldn't figure out with samples of 100, 500. If we're up to 5,000, 50,000, 500,000, 5 million, obviously there are more things we can do that will find interesting outcomes. So I'll leave that there.
Campus, obviously our overall goal is to improve health. And where data science comes in is that we need to leverage these big data sets to ultimately improve medical practice, whether that's treatment, diagnosis, or even prevention. Since I'm in a school of public health, a lot of focus on prevention. So I guess not new direction in several years now is, you may have heard in the news, personalized medicine. And that's where a lot of the big data can be used to try to tailor, again, treatments, diagnosis, and so on, to be more precise. And I think people are using actually the word precision medicine to be more accurate. Personalized denotes each person has their own treatment, which is not necessarily the goal, but the goal is to have more precise treatments and diagnosis and so on. So I work with collaborators who are pulmonary researchers studying chronic smoking, also alcohol use disorders. And they're trying to generate these very large data sets, typically molecular, especially genetic information. How do we do that? How do we use that to either identify biomarkers for diseases or potential therapeutics? Other types of big data, of course, imaging is very common, especially with neuroscience, but also you see that with lung disease. And what is new direction I'm seeing a lot more of, and I even have a pilot data set for this, is wearable devices. And we track patterns, whether, for example, this activity, that's the simplest, but also, for example, for lung disease, looking at how often people use inhalers. You can actually have a monitor on the inhaler that will track. So to get more accurate estimates, typically these have been self-reported, and we all know, of course, when you're facing a doctor, of course, you're going to say what you're supposed to be doing rather than what you really are. So all that will just give more accurate information. So, and I think that's where data science comes in, is to leverage that information.
Can you hear? Okay. Well, it's hard to know where to begin with urban planning because it's, cities are just awash in data, and especially with the, advent of the smart cities paradigm, there's just more and more data all the time. And so a real challenge for us is I know challenges is later, but is how do we train our planners to be able to, without necessarily being computer scientists, how to leverage that data and use it, because it's data. This data can have a huge influence in a lot of urban planning decisions. And I often, when I talk to our alums and various urban planners, I'll occasionally will ask them about, are you doing data-driven management? And the answer is usually, I really wish I was, but I can't. And it's a combination of we don't have the time, we don't have the resources, and also sometimes the decision makers, the city council, would rather not know what's really happening. And so there's an interesting, disconnect going on there. But I'll give you an example of how, where big data could have a huge impact on urban planning, and that's like traffic and parking, a huge domain. But so if we look at parking, one of the biggest things that urban planners do is they have to decide on parameters for developments, what in a given zoning district, what the building, the setbacks, the characteristics of the building, how tall it's going to be. And one thing they have to determine is how many parking spaces. There's the minimum number of parking spaces, and that is entirely should be driven by data. How many parking spaces per square foot should you have, per unit should you have, and that's a classic example of something where people just go by these very old rules that are not tested and not tried, not data validated at all. But yet now we have these really great tools to do that. And now, especially with some of the the parking data that we're getting now, that most cars are Bluetooth enabled. There's devices now embedded in a lot of streets that can actually see where people are parking at different times. Cities like San Francisco now have a parking app. You can actually see where which street's parking space is being occupied at any given time. And you even can look at how people are moving. A single car is moving over the course of a day. And based on those kinds of patterns that you look for in the data, you could actually say, we're overbuilding parking by 25 or 50 or 100% in this area over here. In fact, we're building parking for the highest use part of the day. And in fact, we could actually load share parking between this facility and this facility, and we could share a vast number of parking spaces could be reduced. And we would free up a whole bunch of land that wouldn't be in parking spaces anymore. Those are the kinds of issues we could really get at, but it's like we're in the infancy of dealing with this kind of stuff. Very, very hard, and a lot of this stuff is being, held by third-party private companies, and so a lot of it's just we're working it out right now. But the potential is huge.
So I'm going to actually echo some of the things Austin said. So like I said, I work at Google, and on Google Drive, we're all about trying to save people time. So a lot of these principles that Austin just described for parking spaces and for kind of saving space there, we can apply similarly to saving time. I think one of the great opportunities in a position like where I am with Google Drive is that we just have tons of data. And when I say tons of data, I mean, we have every month 1 billion users using our product, most of them using it more than once. So if we just look at our data points for people opening files in Google Drive, well, it happens about 1,000 or 2,000 times every second, which means that we're not short of data. But what that means is that we can then do things to say, okay, how can we save people time? How can we, basically I look at it and say, how can we enhance people's lives? Whether that's people in their personal life saying, well, we're going to spend a little less time on this mundane task because we've just made it that much easier using the data we have. Or people in a work environment saying, hey, you're going to get just a little more done. Your business is going to get just a little more valuable. There's going to be just a little more productivity because we've managed to put the right things in front of you and save you a bit of time. So the example I like to use is if any of you use Google Drive and you see quick access at the top, which is kind of these files, well, on average, it takes 8 seconds less to open a file that's shown there than anywhere else. Given our number of users, that means that every day we save a career's worth of work time, which is one of these things where it's like, okay, it's only 8 seconds, but we have a ton of data, we have a ton of users, so you can have a bit of impact there. And all we're trying to do is just make a simple, mundane task a little easier by putting a file in front of you. Now, Austin also talked about saying, like, okay, what are the old paradigms that we've used, and how can data help us out? And again, using data, if you were to build something like that without any data, the obvious thing would be, well, what are the last few files that a person opened? And there are comparable things for pretty much any problem. If you have a little more data, you can improve a bit on that. So I think in my field at least, it's all about productivity, and the opportunity is how can we use data to then proactively suggest things to the users that they're already trying to do so that they don't have to go, if you're trying to open some file that's 16 directories deep, if we can give you that file right off the bat, then we've saved you some time. You're less likely to be pulling out your hair at the end of the day, and maybe you've had time to go at the end of the week and spend an extra hour hiking or something like that once in a while. So I feel like that's where the opportunity is between the amount of data that we have and honestly the advances that have been made in computing infrastructure and the tools for working with this data that really allow us to perform that sort of analysis.
Thank you, everyone. So I'm very protective of the Q&A time at the end. I wanted to make sure that we get through the rest of the content. And so we've got 2 more questions. I'm going to ask everyone to try to hone in on the meat of what they want to say and spend just a little bit less time on answering these. So I apologize for cutting it short. I just want to give you all a chance to ask this panel the things that are burning. So flipping it up, what do you think is the greatest challenge or the biggest obstacle towards applying data science to your field? And we'll kick it back to the end.
One of the biggest challenges in the field that I'm looking at is there are very strong incentives not to collect or analyze data in the industry of cannabis for decades. And so what does it mean to all of a sudden overnight create a new data culture where all of a sudden not only we're at very strong incentives not to collect data, now the state's requiring you to collect data and send the data to the state. So what does it mean to kind of create a data culture or in that kind of new kind of constraint where all of a sudden you're now being promoted or employed based on your ability to sort of collect reliable data? And so for me, the biggest challenge that I see my field facing is like, how do we go about creating data cultures from scratch where none had existed before? And how do people make sense of data when they had very strong reasons not to ever write or collect anything that they're doing?
As Austin kind of alluded to with professional planners, I mean, I think a lot of our researchers have spent their career with relatively small data sets and with regression type techniques, quasi experiments that look at, where the scarcity is data. And so now if there's a ton of data, they have to learn how to manage it. And some of the newer techniques that, I think you were just talking about, but other techniques that are available that are maybe better than what they learned. So it's kind of a retraining thing, and maybe that's not so hard. Maybe this group and others know how to make that easy, but I feel like, faculty and researchers get stuck in the mode that they're used to. And again, that's been kind of small to moderate sized data and easy to manage, and they know what to do with it, and it's what gets published in the journals. But suddenly having, close to infinite scale data and how to manage that and use the right techniques is a thing people need to learn.
I'll try to be quick in the biomedical field in terms of data. So we said a lot about big data, but big data doesn't necessarily mean good data. If if it hasn't been collected properly, and I'm thinking in my field more, whether there's animal models or human subjects, if there's potential biases in how the data is collected, you can't resolve that with data science. So that's important. So it's very important to plan to collect good big data. The other one I'm thinking about is, again, what our often limitation is, yes, we have big data, but often we have small sample sizes. So again, if you're collecting data from animals or human subjects, that's usually the limiting factor, even though on each of those individuals, you may have not just hundreds or thousands, but even millions of measurements. The unit is usually the limiting factor, is the number. And a lot of statistics and so on is based on having large samples numbers. And finally, another challenge that we face is data processing. I would say 2/3 of the time is spent on processing the data. It comes out of a machine. We have cores that generate these data sets, but there's a lot of work to get it to a point where you can actually analyze it, and that has to be done right and not rushed. And it's usually not as glamorous, so we try not to rush through the process, but it really makes a difference to actually then later make inferences.
So I guess there's a number of challenges for planning right now. We're definitely awash in data, and I would say lacking somewhat in information, because we turning that into a signal that's usable is difficult. Another issue that I think is huge is the best data out there that relates to cities about how people in cars and are moving and buying things and how they feel at any given moment is held mainly by private companies. Some of those companies have been very forward and forthcoming about sharing, and others not as much. I think we're still working out what's that relationship between cities and just government in general and the private corporations that keep huge amounts of data. And that's something that's going to be worked out in the next few years to decades. And but there's tremendous amounts of value in those data sets. Some is accessible and some of that isn't. And the last thing I'd say is the talent pipeline, that we don't really have a great pipeline for urban analytics experts, right? We have urban planners, we have engineers, we have data scientists and computer scientists. We need some place where they all meet in the middle, where they, the folks who are, really literate in computer science and engineering are asking the right urban questions, and the folks on the urban side and the policy side are able to read and understand the studies and the advances coming out from the engineering and the science. And so we're kind of missing those people who sit in the middle there, and that would really benefit planning if we had more of those. I don't know how to do it, but that's a challenge.
Two or maybe three things. Number one is knowing what questions to ask of your data. So I can look at it and say, I want to save people time doing this. But sometimes saying, I want to save people time doing this doesn't translate easily to here's an easy way to measure this. So you got to think, well, what's a good proxy for that? How do I measure that? And how do I make sure that what I'm measuring is actually getting at the solution I actually want and not something else? So the measurement, because you are what you measure. Secondly, I totally forgot. And so I guess second challenge is the data in my mind. And the third challenge, and this gets more to the third question that we're going to discuss, is fairness and some of the ethics. I remember the second one is privacy, especially with something like Google. People are very concerned about privacy, and rightfully so. And how do you respect that privacy? And it gets even more interesting when you're dealing with business accounts, because business A might not want you using things you've learned from their data for business B, which is a competitor. But it gets really complicated if you're trying to go, okay, we're going to sort out these models and things we've learned as this we learned from this customer and this we learned from this customer, and never the twain shall meet. So you get into interesting challenges there with what data you're allowed to use or mix, and and where the trade-off is, and it gets into legal and contractual obligations as well in some of these cases. So again, measuring the right thing, privacy, and then fairness and ethical concerns.
Thank you, everyone. So the last question, we're going to kick off to you. but it's about ethics. And I sent all these questions to all the panelists ahead of time, consider what their answers wanted to be. But I feel like this is kind of one of the hard questions for me that's come up in this symposium, because trying to deal with ethics in data science requires such an interdisciplinary perspective. And because when I say ethics, I think probably all of you cashed that word out in a different way. And you drew from different, maybe gender studies, or maybe ethnic studies, or maybe moral philosophy, or maybe legal studies to try to frame what ethics meant when I say, how does ethics apply to data science in your field? And so I'm going to complicate this third question a little bit is, what are the ethical challenges that you're facing in the application of data science? And how are you even framing the idea of what ethics means? Is it explicit in your profession? Is this something that you have personal commitments to? Like you already brought up privacy. Is that a Google thing? Is that a moral philosophy thing? Like where are you drawing this notion of ethics from? Was it part of your professionalization and your training that you came up with from your mentors? Like where does that come from? So it's the two parts. What is the ethical challenge? And how are you even understanding what that framing question means, and where did you come from that? Does that make sense from the panelists before we kick it off to you?
All right, I'll try to take a stab at that. So for me, the one very serious ethical question that arises in legalization in the cannabis industry has been the cumulative effects of the drug war on communities of color. And sort of how do we go about, now that there are billions of dollars in cash on the table, so how do we go about thinking about rectifying some of those wrongs that when we're undertaking these major policy changes, how do we tie these major policy changes that are creating huge economic opportunities and making sure we tie that back into the communities that have been disproportionately affected by these old policies that we're now getting rid of. And so for me, the ethical challenges are how do we go about doing activities like expungement. So if there's people who currently have criminal records or still serving time for doing things because they were selling a dime bag, 10 years ago, now that, a white guy who looks like me can do that out of a storefront as, making a nice markup on that. How do we go about making sure that we are rectifying those wrongs? And that's very hard because oftentimes if you think about the criminal justice system, where does all the data about who has criminal records and where do they live? That all lives PDFs in courthouses that are for every different county here in Colorado. There's no one necessarily central database. So if you want to undertake an activity doing sort of statewide expungement of criminal records for people who have drug offenses, that becomes a very difficult task. And there are people at the ACLU who are doing really interesting things in New York and California, where those jurisdictions have tied legalization to more of these social justice initiatives that we're going to tie legalization and these new economic opportunities to sort of righting the wrongs of the drug war. Here in Colorado, we were first to move on legalization. I think we're lagging a little bit on pursuing some of these other important social missions.
I feel like social scientists have always had an ethical approach to data and privacy and whatnot. But again, with a small scale research, smaller numbers of people, smaller numbers of observations, that it was easier than when it is at a whole nother order of magnitude, even just mistakes with how you hold the data and how you keep the privacy. So I think that is an issue. I think also, and this ties a little bit also back to Austin and urban planning, but in my school also we have criminal justice as a field of scholarship, and a lot of the research there is in spatial context, so body cameras and cameras everywhere, right? And those are very good things for gathering data about things we want to know about, but they're also good things for gathering data about things we might not want people to know where we were, and whoever's holding that data potentially can put all those things together in a way that they couldn't before. So all the great things about smart cities and smart policing that come from big data have a downside if it's abused, and it can be abused. I mean, I know the protests in Hong Kong, there's all the facial recognition stuff that's been going on, and all that can certainly be used in this country as well down the road.
Area, which I know the best. There's ethical issues, of course, with data collection that I mentioned before too. From if you have animals, are they treated in a humane way? And there's review boards that try to review those processes. For human research, medical establishment has had a historically, even the last 50 years, cases where data was not ethically obtained. Again, there's systems that are in place to try to review those processes. So that's data collection. Once you have the data, then you have to think about data privacy and protecting sensitive information. Usually what I work with is de-identified, so names, addresses, visits, even hospital visits, clinic visits are considered identifiable, and those are all removed. But there are some kinds of data that even if you remove those, they're still considered identifiable, like genetic data. So that's probably the biggest example of that. And as we're moving to this personalized medicine approach, that becomes a big issue because we need to be able to use that genetic data, but at the same time, it's protected and identifiable. So we have to think a lot about when we have genetic data, who has access to it, how is it stored, and there's extra layers of protection for genetic data and other sensitive data like that.
Obviously, lots of ethical considerations when we're dealing with cities and communities, and particularly vulnerable communities. And so this is something that's core to the planning education. It's part of our required curriculum as part of the American Institute of Certified Planners to learn about these kind of ethical considerations. And everybody knows that data has power, and power can be abused, and it has been by planners in the past. And so there's a lot of kinds of applications where this can be an issue. Obviously, anything having to do with privacy is a big deal. And often we see people with more resources, more money, are better able to protect their privacy than those without. There's some particular planning specific cases where data could actually end up in some ethically murky kinds of outcomes. Like, for instance, if we're doing micro-targeting studies around foot traffic and economic patterns and things like that, and it could actually help direct developers towards gentrifying a neighborhood that otherwise might not be, and maybe much faster than it otherwise would be, resulting in lots of displacement of vulnerable people, and that may have been enabled by data. And so you have to be very, very careful about these kinds of things.
So in the machine learning world, at least, and this applies partly to things like Google Drive, one of the big ethical concerns is what we might call fairness. There have been several stories, if you're taking a course on machine learning and you touch on ethics, you're almost certain to see pictures on the screen showed of newspaper headlines, generally something like, some image recognition algorithm that identifies African Americans as apes or something like that, and generally that's a result of having bad data coming in or not being careful enough with how you're tuning things, and it's obviously not something we want. Or similarly, even more recently, some facial recognition that was, I believe, had used on driver's licenses, and it turns out that there was some thought of using it, or maybe it was actually used for immigration and customs enforcement stuff, and it turns out that on non-white people it was wrong more often than it was right. So the very group that it was being used on was the group that it did not perform well on. So there are some serious ethical considerations here, and again, a lot of these things come from what sort of data are you collecting when you're building something? Like, if I'm building a machine learning algorithm for something like facial recognition or such, what are my samples? Who am I using? Am I getting a lot of people that just look like me? Because then it's going to probably perform really well on white men with beards. But it might not perform very well on someone of a different race or a different facial structure or something like that. And that's not fair. So Shea also asked us to get to the core of, where does your ethics kind of come from? Well, mine comes from basically two statements. One is love your neighbor as yourself, and the other is do to others what you would have them do unto you. And to me, that means, look, if I'm doing something with data, I'd better A, be happy if somebody was doing that to me, and B, look at this and say, look, is this going to treat everybody else, anybody who could possibly be affected by this, exactly the same way it's going to treat me? Am I gaining any advantage? Or would I have any advantage, or would somebody else have any advantage over another person based on how this is being applied? that we can then say, no, that's not okay. What are we going to do to make sure that that doesn't happen? To me, that's kind of the heart of a lot of this ethics is do to others what you want them to do to yourself. Don't subject somebody else to something. That also gets to the privacy sort of thing. Like, I don't want my private information getting out there. Specific challenge in something like quick access. Well, let's say you're a manager and you've got a file that's a performance improvement plan for an employee. You don't want that showing up when you open your screen at the beginning of a team meeting, because that's not fair to you or the employee who's under the performance improvement plan. And as someone developing the feature, it's like, I have to care about that, because what if it's my performance improvement plan? I don't need my whole team knowing about it.
All right, we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. Do we have any mic runners? One here. Are you taking my mic? You taking my any other mic runners or just you? Okay, and then I'd love to kick off Q&A with someone who hasn't spoken up yet, or particularly if you're a student. I don't know if we have any students left in the audience. I'd like to give preference for students or someone who hasn't spoken yet.
I'm a student currently, and I find that this is a little bit off topic, I think, but my time is pretty limited, and I got some advice a year ago to pick a programming language and master that programming language. And in data science in particular, I find that there's two competing languages, R and Python. Do you guys in your fields notice any trends or any specific preferences towards specific languages, or does it matter? What are your thoughts on the difference between Python and R?
So I'll just say for the field that I'm looking at, what people in the industry are working really hard on, like getting stuff off of clipboards into Excel, and then like using VLOOKUP. It seems like a huge like technological paradigm shift is like having different sheets. And like being able to combine different sheets together is a huge leap in like technological capabilities, and just thinking about like the kinds of possibilities once you can join data together seems really exciting for people right now.
I'm far from an expert on either, but we just sent several students to Boulder for training in R this summer. It seems like in social science that's what gets talked about more than Python, but that's just a not well-informed opinion.
Biostatistics and bioinformatics, I would say R, and secondary Python. Those both would serve you well.
If you want to do the big spatial stuff, you have to know both.
You'd expect someone from Google to have a comment on the programming language, but I don't really. Actually, we mostly use Java, which is not written for that, but it's like, we've got about 1 million layers of our own tools and such, so it's like, I use Java to interact with them, which is not particularly helpful to a student.
So on the topic of fairness, so some of you talked about, I think it was Timothy there at or one of the last ones, but somebody comes up with a model, and maybe the data set they were working with, the toy problem they had, happened to deal with white men with beards, or something else like that. But then someone says, oh, hey, this model, we could use it for immigration, or we could use it to figure out who needs food, some kind of social thing, or tracking students in a campus, and then all of a sudden they're using it to track people in Hong Kong. So how do you either not share your model or protect against the, I guess, incorrect or unintended use of those models? So the application part that came after the research that wasn't even considered in the research.
Couple thoughts on that. One is, I think one of the ethical challenges is how do you get the right people concerned about the ethics of knowing what they're working with. In the case of something like sharing a model that might be useful, and I don't want to just say, oh, well, it's not my responsibility how somebody uses my model. But so I guess there are some concerns. Number one, if you're in a corporate situation and you're putting a model out there, you have some licensing abilities, I think, that you can use, or contractual things if somebody's buying the model to control how they use it. And I think you need to be very careful about how you do that. And number two, I think you have to be careful about maintaining control of the model. If it's something that has those sorts of concerns, I think there's a lot to be said for saying, well, I'm not going to just publish this model. Maybe I have this data set and I might be willing to share it, but I have to be concerned. Like I don't want to be just closed off with data, because that doesn't help people much either. But really, I think you have to be very public with analyzing and saying, here are some of the limitations of this. And if it turns out that the data set is flawed, because it produces some of these models or something, then I think you need to either be clear about that or say, look, this data set is flawed. We're going to withdraw it. We're not going to publish it. We're not going to share it. And then also, I think in some of these cases, it's worth considering what you can do with, if you have a model, providing the model as a service rather than as a model, because that retains some control over how it's going to be used. But it's definitely a huge challenge out there is how does something like data sharing and model sharing, in this case, work with ethics when it's, you've got two parties then whose ethics you have to depend on, both yours and whoever's using it. So I think you have to be comfortable with, well, what are the conditions under which I share this and how the ethics work out on that end.
What community development or communication structure would you like to see to address some of your data validation and data security, in addition to hardware and software infrastructure concerns? I'm sorry, that didn't come out as a coherent sentence. All of you are different stakeholders from across academia, industry, and research. And all of you have challenges from hardware and software infrastructure, in addition to validating the data, in addition to providing access to only certain pieces of it. If we want to address that from a community standard or a standardized approach from a community perspective, what would you like to see in order to have that be accomplished?
So one thing that happens in the cannabis industry is like a highly regulated industry. Again, everyone's submitting all their data to the government every single day, but they're relying on this like very complex assemblage of both like hardware tools. So like every plant gets its own tag, and then so you go into a grow and you like wave around this, like they call it a magic wand. You wave around this magic wand and like it counts all the tags that are in a room. Law enforcement officers can come in and do audits anytime, and they should be able to wave around their magic wand to get the same numbers that you have in your database. But if someone in your organization has like entered data or done some data cleanup or something like that, all of a sudden now you're like faced with like, okay, like the law enforcement officer comes in and says there's 80 plants in here, but like your database entry says, oh, there's 95 plants here. Then you're going to have like, well, where did these 15 plants go? And like you should be able to account for all 15 of those. So there's very strong incentives to sort of like couple, like make sure there's like robust linkage between like the data representation, the actual plants that are sitting somewhere, and like how we go about collecting that data. People think a lot about how we sort of like preserve that chain of custody to make sure like all that data is being preserved and tracked, and we can account for it at every step of the way. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things getting into the system that shouldn't be, or that there aren't like hacks or like risks that people are exploiting as well, even in this highly regulated, highly monitored system.
I think it may be a little naive, but I think in academia, over the years, we've evolved a pretty good set of guide rails around data, around IRBs and, publication standards and all that sort of thing. But, and it certainly there are failures where, things happen. But I think with bigger data and data science, all those parameters are going to be tested more and more often, and whether they're robust enough to handle that, it will be something we'll have to work on and figure out going forward.
I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but with these high throughput data sets in the biomedical sciences, there's now a requirement to have those in the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, to be published. So to actually publish your work, you have to deposit the data in the standardized repository. You have these standardized formats. You have to describe how the data was processed. So I think that helps with keeping consistency in the field. And just requiring it, I think, for publication, makes a big difference.
One thing I'll just make a plug for right now, maybe a little off topic, is metadata, and just how in a field like planning where you're dealing with hundreds of different themes of data, if you don't have good metadata protocols, you're just forget it. You're not gonna be able to use it. So,
I guess as far as community involvement, since I work in something that's very much people touch all the time, when something is not looking right or something like that, there are feedback mechanisms. Use them. I don't work on image processing, like I said, but if you got this picture, it's identified an ape or something like that, and it was a picture of you, and there's a feedback button. Sometimes you have to dig a little too far for it. You hit that. That's going to draw attention. So for some of these things that hit everybody, look for ways to give feedback if there's something that's not looking right or something like that. Because when you have billions of pieces of data, we can't look at them all individually and see everything that's going wrong. But if we find out that something goes wrong, generally that's something we care about, and we don't want that going wrong because we care about that. So it ends up being something that gets looked at.
So I think we have time for 2 more questions. I think you were first, and I think you were. If there are other, if we go quickly, we can do a third. Let's try it.
All right. So I think you all are managers or PIs. So what do you do to make a good data science team and build a good data science team and promote the data science literacy within research teams and what would you recommend for growing students, to fill some skill gaps that you currently see as needed, but not quite easy to have it right away?
I mean, so when I think about my research team, we don't only look at the cannabis industry, but I think data provenance. So thinking a lot about where the data comes from, how is it generated, how does those data generation processes, how could they introduce biases, how is it maybe sampled or not representative of a larger population. So I think that's a very kind of critical skill, is thinking about the whole data generation pipeline and thinking about this data that you're looking at and trying to analyze isn't sort of come down from stone tablets, but it is a process of a human process. And has human biases, and so so just making sure that you can fully account for all the different ways that your data, where it comes from, how it originates, and how that's going to influence your analysis strategy.
So I think keep an eye out on some of these emerging hybrid disciplines that bring data science together with other disciplines. I'll give you a good example: eco-informatics. That's a pretty new field. You'll rarely find an eco-informatics department, but once in a while you'll find someone doing, a faculty member or PhD student who focuses on just that within a computer science department or within an environmental science department. Often those people are the glue that can bind together a disparate research group that has some engineers, some computer scientists, and some disciplinary people. It's really helpful to often find that person who is that hybrid scholar. They're hard to find. I've been lucky that I've gotten to work with quite a few people who are really literate in data science, really good programmers, but also, a really good environmental scientist or urban planner or something like that. But lacking that kind of person in there, I think it's just you got to talk a lot, and you have to share literature with each other and explain what that literature means. And I mean, this is one of the biggest challenges in academia right now, is forming good interdisciplinary teams where that literacy can be shared across disciplines.
I was wondering if y'all had any thoughts about the relationship between reproducible research and these concerns about having like your biases and your weights of your model trained published out. So if you're dealing with a very large data set, like facial recognition, for instance, you might think, oh, I don't want to put out the weights. I don't want to too carefully describe what I'm doing because then someone could abuse it, right? I'm wondering, is this always going to be in direct opposition to this push towards having someone in reproducible research pull up your paper that's fully describing what you're doing? But yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Are there any thoughts about that?
I think it's a legitimate concern. At the same time, there's a principle I think that you need to adhere to when you're doing research and such, and that's don't publish stuff that's not good. Well, I mean, I know this is an academic setting, so everybody's laughing. But at some point, in facial recognition or something like that, at some point, maybe there's an onus on you to make sure that you've got an algorithm that, or a model or something, if you're going to publish it, that is actually good and maybe is a little more robust to some of these concerns that you might have. I think that's a starting place at least. Or just, again, there's a balance between what's on you and what's on somebody else who is reproducing it. And I think at any point, anybody could take pretty much any research that's out there and abuse it in some way. So there's a split of responsibilities there. Like, you need to be upfront as the publisher, I think, and say, hey, here are the limitations of this. If you did something, say facial recognition, and it was facial recognition that only used white men with beards, make sure you say that and warn that, hey, look, this is not likely to be good outside of the bounds within which we trained it. So you say, this is really only good for white men with beards. And then at the same time, try to get something that actually, that where a lot of these concerns are mitigated. If you can train something that's better or improve on that so that it works well for everyone, great, do that. If not, then, yeah, you said there is some opposition between could somebody misuse this. At the same time, people can very easily misuse a lot of the stuff we know about the atom. To pick something really obvious, or about disease to pick something else really obvious. Like, things have been misused, and there's, I think, a balance between what's the value from publishing this research, and is that greater than the potential costs? And in a lot of cases, we've decided, yeah, there's a lot more value in publishing research on Ebola because we can cure cases than the risk that somebody might use it to make a biological weapon or something like that.
I need to ask that there are so many machine learning and deep learning models are available. So in terms of academic research, should we focus more on the mathematics behind the models, or should we more focus on the implementation, how we can extend the problem or to solve that?
Probably depends on which one you like more. Because to be quite honest, there are always new developments going on, both on how these things are applied and on the actual math behind them. So speaking for my team working on quick access, we've got people who will be looking at what are the latest papers in machine learning and such that are proposing new techniques and how can we apply them, and then saying, okay, so that's really valuable that there are people doing that. At the same time, developing all these new techniques and new science, well, anything like that is begging to be used and to see if it's used. So there's really, you need both. You can't, at some point, you're limited in how much you can improve the actual application without new developments in the research or improvements in the research. But all the improvements in the research in the world don't do much good except for maybe, getting some publication counts up or something like that if they're not actually being used. So really, the two go hand in hand. It's like, a chicken and egg problem. They're both necessary. So in some sense, I'd say, well, look at where do you want to go and what's really interesting to you. Is there a path forward in that? But there's work to be done in both in applications and in the theory.
Please give them a round of applause for joining us.